In this video, we are going to continue talking about Chapter 34 and the Federal Reserve. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the tools of the Fed. So really in this chapter, what we are doing is we're looking at the Federal Reserve, right? We're looking at how they could change the money supply, which could change aggregate demand. All right, and in the next chapter, we're going to be looking at how those policies, right, can affect the macro economy. Right, so here we're learning about how the Fed might do certain things, and then in the next chapter, we're going to be looking at how that affects the economy. Right, how those things affect the economy. Right, and these are the the big ones for the Fed, right? So these are the things that are they are going to use, right, in order to try to manipulate the macroeconomy. All right, so the first tool of the Fed that we'll talk about is called open market operations. Right, we will be abbreviating it as OMO. The second is the payment of interest on total reserves. Right, so those are the two tools. We're going to spend most of our time talking about this first one, our open market operations. There's also some other things that we're going to kind of put with the open market operations that we will consider in the next chapter as kind of tools, but your textbook puts them kind of together, so just for simplicity's sake, we're going to put those together as well. All right, so open market operations and payment of interest on total reserves. So those are those reserves held by the Fed for other banks and financial institutions. All right, but let's go ahead and start looking at our open market operations. So open market operations, this is where the Fed is changing the money supply by buying or selling government bonds. All right, so kind of the simplest version of how these work or why the Fed is going to be doing this, we can see by looking at when the Fed wants to increase the money supply. All right, so let's say that the Fed wants to increase the money supply. All right, so they create money, as we know they can do from the first video for this chapter, right? Creating money is one of the jobs of the Fed. So they create this money. What do they do with it after they create it, right? Now, just kind of print a bunch of currency, then fly a helicopter over a city and just dump it out and let it rain money. That would be nice. Actually, that would probably be terrible. Probably a lot of people would get hurt, but regardless, right, that's obviously not what they do. I think we would have heard about that by now. Right, so they have to have some mechanism for getting that newly created money into the economy. Right, so what they will do is they will start buying government bonds. Right, so any kind of banks and financial institutions that have these bonds can sell them. Right, so when a bank sells a bond to the Fed, the Fed will take that bond, and then they will just go into their account, right? Go onto the computer into their account and just add however much worth, the dollar amount of the bonds that were bought, right? So this way money goes from the Fed to whoever is selling that bond, increasing the money supply. All right, I'm essentially just going to write that statement down. All right, so, or the point at the end of it, right? And that is buying bonds increases the money supply and selling bonds decreases the money supply. All right, so that is the big point for open market operations. This is the mechanism by which the Federal Reserve is going to influence aggregate demand, right? Or at least most often. Right, probably the biggest way, right? So this is going to be one of the tools that we're really focusing on in the next chapter, right? This is the how, and in the next chapter we'll be looking at the why, right? Right, that is really the big point of, as I just said, really the big point of open market operations, but there are also some other things that we're going to talk about. So we're not quite done with these open market operations. I was just about to do open market operations, right? That's not what I wanted. Right, we're going to talk about the relationship between open market operations and interest rates. All right, so when the Fed is using open market operations, the Fed is entering the market for loanable funds. Right, so there are probably a lot of people as well as a lot of financial institutions and banks that have money that they can lend out, right, and that they're willing to lend out for the right interest rate. And this isn't really how it is, but we kind of think of it in a very static way of there's just money lying around, right? Like people just have money lying around and they're willing to lend it to somebody, right, at some interest rate for however long. Probably most of us know how loans work, right? And there is kind of at any given time kind of a finite amount of these loanable funds, right? So when the Fed enters that market, right, in either the buying or the selling, right, they are going to have an effect on the market for those loanable funds. And specifically, they're going to have an effect on the price. All right, so before we talk about that, all right, or dive in a little deeper, let's just do a brief overview of bonds. All right, so if any of us are not familiar, so bonds essentially work like this, right? So they are put with stocks and securities and all that kind of stuff for a reason. They are an investment tool, or they can be. You will buy a bond, right? Let's say that the government's just issuing new bonds, right? They might say, hey, here, we've got this 20-year bond for $100, right? So and then it's worth 500 at maturity, right? Now that's a ridiculous amount, and you probably that would be a crazy interest rate. But what you do is you give the government that $100, right? You get that bond, and then at the end of the 20 years, you can kind of turn it in for the $500. Right? So you are investing, right? You're expecting a return, right? So that the price of the bond, right, is similar to the interest rate, right? The government has to change the price of the bond to compete for loanable funds, right? If their bonds aren't competitively priced, nobody's going to buy them, right? But that's essentially how bonds work. And again, the kind of rate of return, right, has to kind of be competitive with other interest rates that are available. All right. All right. When selling bonds, the Fed increases the demand for loanable funds. Right, so when the government is selling these bonds, they say, "Hey, we have these bonds. We will give you this bond. You give us money." All right, so that money that could have gone to, you know, a home loan, a car loan, a small business loan, what have you, right? It goes to the Fed instead, right? And essentially, what we can think of this as is that the number of buyers in the market increases when the Fed starts buying these bonds, right? So there's a new entrant in the market for loanable funds, right? This is going to increase demand, right? So it increases the demand for the loanable funds, right? And if we think all the way back to chapter 4, right? What happens when the demand increases, all right? For a good, right? So nothing else changes, just a shift in demand, right? A shift to the right, an increase in demand, right? Hopefully we remember that the price of that good increases, right? And that's exactly what happens here, right? When the Fed is selling these bonds, they're increasing the demand for loanable funds, all right? And that leads to an increase in the price of those funds. All right, and as we already mentioned, right, that's ugly interest. As we've already mentioned, the price of a loan, right, the price of loanable funds is the interest rate, all right? So an increase in demand, that's going to lead to an increase in price. Price of loanable funds is the interest rate. So when the Fed sells bonds, they increase the demand, right, and the price or the interest rate increases. Right, and the Fed can only affect real interest rates. So those are interest rates adjusted for inflation in the short run. So they're not going to be able to have any long-term impact on those real interest rates. I can probably fit that in here. All right. All right, so there are a couple other things that we're going to talk about real quick before we move on to the final, the final tool, the second tool of the Fed. All right, first we're going to talk about the federal funds rate. All right, so this is the overnight rate. Banks lend to other banks. All right, I'm not sure if that's grammatically correct, but that's okay. All right, so this is the thing that I mentioned at the top of this. All right, the federal funds rate, we are going to be looking at that in the next chapter as essentially as a tool, but we put it here because we were already talking about those interest rates and of how the open market operations affect them. All right, so the federal funds rate, we know this as the definition says, right, it's the overnight rate. So that's really short term. So again, if a bank, not again because I haven't said it in the first place, so if a bank needs a loan, right, maybe they need some money to make sure that they meet their reserve requirement at the end of the day, right, then they might get a loan from another bank, all right, to kind of balance their books, right, and then that is, and it's just an overnight, very short term, right? So it's not going to have a huge impact on stuff because it is very short term, right? However, it's used more as a signal for what type of policy the Fed is trying to use, right? So it is kind of important as an indicator of the Fed's intentions, essentially. But we will talk about how that signals the different policies in the next chapter. All right, the last thing is quantitative easing. All right, quantitative easing is when the Fed buys longer term government bonds or other securities in order to push down long-term interest rates. All right, so in terms of kind of bond length, this is the 10 to 30 year range, so pretty good little ways away. But that is what quantitative easing is, right? They're trying to push down those long-term interest rates by buying longer-term government bonds and other securities, right? And slash or. I think it's usually bonds, but there are times when they do securities, like during the recession. All right. But that is it for quantitative easing. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. All right, so let's move on to the second tool of the Fed, which is payment, and this is going to take very little time. All right, so payment of interest on total reserves. All right, so in October of 2008, the Fed began paying interest on total reserves. All right, so before this, the Fed did not pay any interest. So it was essentially, hey, we're the safest bet. You know, we are the bank of the United States. If we go down, you got bigger fish to fry. Then there are bigger problems happening than you losing your money. All right, so very safe, very stable place to keep your money. All right, and so that, I guess that had to be reward enough for their depositors. All right, probably also no other institution in the U.S. was capable of managing that amount of money. That might not be true, I don't know. All right, that's pure conjecture. But it is true that prior to October 2008, no interest was being paid. All right, so this led to a bit of a problem because the Fed sometimes found that the banks and financial institutions that held accounts with them were kind of doing things counter to their policy, right? That if they're trying to increase the aggregate demand or increase the money supply, right, sometimes the holders of these accounts, right, would be doing things kind of that went against that policy type. All right, so that's why they started paying interest on those reserves, so that way they could kind of incentivize, right? Incentivize or disincentivize holding, more or less money in those accounts. All right. When interest went up, right? So the interest paid went up. This led to a decrease in the money supply. All right, so just very quickly, so if the interest rate goes up, that means there's a higher rate of return for the people that are leaving money with the Fed. All right, so if you increase the interest rate, you increase the amount of money I'm going to get. I'm more likely to want to put more of my money into that account, right? If that interest rate is more competitive or better than the other places I could lend my money or put my money, right, then I'm going to do that, right? And so that money, once I put it into an account with the Federal Reserve, right, it's no longer circulating around the economy, so the money supply decreases, right? So increase the interest rate, right, it's going to decrease the money supply as account holders put more money into their accounts with the Fed. And then the opposite is also true, right? If you decrease the interest rate, I'm not getting as much money. There might be some other opportunities that are now more lucrative. So I'm going to take my money out of my account with the Fed, and then it's going to go back into the economy because I'm going to lend it to, an entrepreneur or, whatever, right? So I might, again, small business loans, car loans, all these other types of loans, right? But those are the tools of the Fed. So again, this chapter is really more about how. Next chapter is about why. So we will be looking at these tools again, all right, and actually using them in our macroeconomic model, right? But that is it for this video. In the next video, which is going to be the last one for this chapter as well, we are going to be talking about this idea of the Fed being the lender of last resort. But I will see you guys then.